Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of meaningful discussions based on the 13 Petaled Rose with Rabbi Chaim Sperlin.
Good evening and welcome to our final lesson on this series, Lesson 6, or Discussion 6, as we've been calling them. Tonight we will talk about prayer. Prayer is the string through which all of our spiritual and material experience come together. I hope. That's an ideal prayer. I have fond memories of many expert prayers. How do we say that? A person who's an expert prayee. Yes? Is that a word? We just made it. A person who knows how to pray. And as we're going to discover tonight, knowing to pray is an art in itself. And I have memories, first of all, of my uncle, Rabbi Adin Even-Israel Steinstaltz, who was the rabbi of a tiny little shul in the old city in Jerusalem called the Tzemach Tzedek Synagogue. This synagogue is the only synagogue in the old city that was not demolished and bombed in 1948. In 1948, the War of Independence breaks out, and not almost, but all Jews were in the beginning evacuated and then expelled. We were out of the old city of Jerusalem. And that would go on for 19 years until 1967, when coming up this Wednesday, Yom Yerushalayim, when Jerusalem is redeemed again for the first time in 19 years. But the first time under our control, because in 1948, we didn't really have time to make Jerusalem under our control. So really, it's Jerusalem ours for the first time in 2,000 years, which we celebrate this Wednesday. In this little synagogue, Tzemach Tzedek Shul, the only synagogue that's not blown up in 1948, when the Arabs take control of old Jerusalem, the first thing they do is destroy all the synagogues. And there were some incredible, beautiful, large synagogues, some of which have been restored and refurbished in modern times. One of the synagogues that was there was a small shul that was in an upstairs apartment. It was like an apartment that was converted into a shul. It was there for about 200 years or 150 years before 1948. And it had a very active community, small but an active community. In 1967, when we make our way back into the old city, they look around to find Jewish remnants. And some of the community members from 19 years earlier remembered that there was a little shul in this second floor apartment that is still standing from the outside. Here is the place where everybody is familiar, the Cardo. It's right here. The Tzemach Tzedek Shul, the upstairs, the downstairs then. And they see that it's still standing there. Incredible. The shul is still there. They come in there and they discover an apartment. It's been converted back into an apartment, but they remove a few pieces of furniture and they discover the plaque that is still there. I didn't get a picture in there. Oh, there it is. Right there in the top left corner is the original plaque when they founded this shul, and it's still there to this very day. This plaque was hidden behind some bookshelf or whatever it is that the residents used for 19 years, but it's been restored. This is the way it is in 1967. Here it is today. This is the shul that I remember. I studied there for a little bit, and every Shabbat, Rabbi Steinstaltz would make the 40-minute trek to this synagogue where he led as the rabbi from 67 until his passing. And I merited many fun walks with him from his house in the German colony to this little shul. Always an experience. He would sit there. He had his seat where he would sit in the beginning of the davening. And any guest that would come in was able to approach him and talk with him. He had, as some of you may know, a very unique sense of humor and always made conversation with whoever was there, sometimes sharp lines, sometimes words of encouragement, whatever came out of his mouth at the time. He would not daven with the minyan. He wouldn't daven with the minyan. The minyan would daven. He would listen to Baruch Hu, to Kaddish, to the Torah reading. He would listen to all the communal rituals. But as the shul goers would disperse at about noon, The room was empty. The room was his. And he would then embark on his own prayer journey. And he would take out a little tiny siddur from his pocket and pace the walls from back and forth. It wasn't very big. He would go there from around 12:30 every Shabbat till 4 or 5 o'clock. And he would just make his rounds, round and around, saying the words, sometimes in this like conversation style, sometimes with a little tune. Very interesting to watch. And I would sit there at the back. You know, he didn't seem to be a guy that really lacked anything. What's he praying for? What's he praying for so long? What's he asking for? Health, he looked okay. Money he didn't care for. Children he had. Overall, very inspirational guy, you know, famous. What's he praying for? What does he need? Didn't seem like he was lacking anything. And those thoughts would cross my mind sometimes. Until a couple years later, I re-met a few people along the way, another rabbi of mine in northern Israel, where unfortunately now there's fires and it's burning and God should protect them. And God willing, we'll hear some good news from there soon. Another rabbi of mine who, here you see him with a little grin, angelic beard, but a regular guy. Regular guy, also good sense of humor, super fun. I used to eat at his house Friday nights. He's still with us. May he live and be well. Rabbi Garevich from Migdal HaEmek. Super guy. But when prayer started, which would happen at around 9 o'clock every morning in yeshiva, it would take him a couple of minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then he would like take off. He would launch. And his face would turn this bright red. Sometimes he would sweat. And he would stay in one place. He wouldn't pace. He would stay in one place. And it was just a scene to watch. You see this guy sweating, sometimes crying. It was just an incredible scene. And that's when I got a little curious about prayer. What is this? There's got to be something here that maybe I have not yet discovered. It's not just asking for the sick to be healed or for those that need a couple of bucks to have some money. There seems to be something here that some of these people that I've drawn inspiration from are finding in prayer that I went on a quest to discover. And one of the places where I found answers is chapter 12 in our wonderful book. I think it's chapter 12, right? Chapter 11. Thank you. Chapter 11 in the 13 Petal Rose. And I hope to share a little bit of what it says here that I hope some of you read, and a little bit of what I've discovered over the years as well. The first question is, and I want to pose this question to you, what is the most troubling, or what is the biggest question you have on prayer, on our prayer? Ozen? It's not a rhetorical question. What is your biggest question on prayer? Repetition. Petition. Okay, that's a good question. That's a general question that you have on the petitioning in prayer. Okay? Anybody yes? Okay, that's a great question. That's a great question. You're asking, why are men obligated to pray in the minyan setting and women are not obligated? It's a large question. I don't know that we'll answer that question tonight. On one foot, women are required to pray, just not in the communal setting necessarily. So just myth busting a little bit, but it's a great question. It's an important question. We'll revisit it, God willing. Yes, it's distracting. Okay. Very good. Very good. So you're asking that prayer, the depth of prayer is easier as an individual than as a community. When it's in a larger setting, it seems to be a distraction from what prayer seems. And as I started in my introduction, it would seem that some of these people felt similarly, right? He would wait until the room is empty and then go on his trek. So that's something we will address. Great question. Yes. Great question. How does that work? It seems that, similar to the question that we had before, it seems that the communal version versus the individual version are not aligning. And that's a big question. The Code of Jewish Law says to pray in a particular setting. It would seem to be counterintuitive if the depth of prayer is accomplished in a different setting. Great question. Anybody else? Yes. Developed. That's a great question. You're saying the structure of the prayer book that we have today, when was that developed? It's a great question. It's an important question. That's also a question that we won't address today Specifically, I will give a little piece on it that the prayer book as we have it today has been developed over time from the First Temple period. We believe some of it to be trickling down even from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The structure of it as we have it today is from the end of the Second Temple period. When the rabbis foresaw the diaspora coming, they needed to replace the community setting, the spiritual community setting, with something. They created not the synagogue setting already existed from much earlier on, but they created a structure in which the synagogue should be used. And that's where a lot of the structure of prayer that we have today comes from. Some people will say, oh, so the rabbis made it up. Not exactly. It's very broad, but that's kind of the text that we have today originates, the structure that we have today originates most closely to the late Second Temple period. But that's just a little parentheses. It's much broader than that. We'll leave that for another time. Maybe maybe at AJ's place one time. Great question, Norm. So what you're asking is that it seems to be odd to be spending so much time massaging God's delicate ego, right? That's recorded. It seems odd. That's a great point. So what is it? I think that what all these questions come together is really one big question about what is this? What is this? One question that didn't come up is the repetition, which I'm surprised. I thought the first question would be repetition. How many times? Again and again and again. Well, you just said this morning, again this afternoon. You said it this afternoon, again this evening. It's like, God has a better memory than we do. If we remembered from this morning, you hope that he certainly remembers from this morning. So what's going on? I hope to address this general idea. On the way there, we will have an introduction as usual. That's great. That's a good point too, which we see a lot. And you see that in general, people that pray often end up it looks like they're just getting through it or something like that. So what the plan tonight is to give an outline of 3 methods of prayer that he outlines in chapter 11. We will talk about those 3 methods. I want to make clear that one of those methods is not robotic prayer. Robotic prayer is not one of the methods of praying correctly. Robotic prayer is a type of prayer that happens because of doing it so often, and sometimes for those that grew up in a religious home from a young age, that it just becomes so natural, so robotic. They don't hear the words they say, and like you're saying, they don't know if it's a Tuesday or a Saturday, whatever. They're just in that setting that tells them that it's Shabbat, so they go for Shabbat. So the 3 methods of prayer that we're going to talk about today are not the robotic version. The robotic version is kind of what happened over time. It's better than nothing, I guess, but it doesn't really get its space as a form of prayer. It's more of just walking through it, or as we used to say, knocking it off. My father once told me that the difference between a quick chazan and a slow chazan is 5 minutes. That's the whole difference. That's the whole difference if a person just takes their time and tries to think about it. The whole difference is 5 minutes. I think he's right. Maybe 10. Maybe. All right. So that is introduction number 1, that the robotic form of prayer is not what we're talking about. Introduction number 2 is something that was mentioned here about the communal versus the individual setting. The communal versus the individual setting, we're going to see traces its way back all the way to where prayer originated as a service in the Holy Temple. There was communal services and there was personal services. We're going to see that on some levels they are separate, but on some levels they overlap with each other, and they're very much connected. So hopefully we will cover that question as well. The third thing, intro number 3, is the following, and I think the most important intro before we go into the crux of today's lesson. And that is that really a person should be praying all day. What I mean to say by that is that what we've discussed over the past 5 lessons is we talked about soul land. We talked about the spiritual realms. We talked about our soul. We talked about the accomplishment that mitzvahs have, but we haven't visited this space. We haven't visited this arena or this consciousness where all this exists. We talked about what happens, but we didn't enter there. Imagine we can enter there. Imagine we can go into that zone. We could go into that space where we stop seeing physics. We stop seeing a table. Now we see, at least metaphysically, at least intellectually, we see that God is behind the table, holding the table together. We start seeing a completely different universe. And really, as one of the rabbis said, halavai, I wish that people would pray all day. What he meant wasn't that people sit and pray all day because you got to make a living. 6 days a week, you got to make a living. But what he meant was that people should live in the consciousness of prayer all day. And what this means to say is that the consciousness of prayer is the expectation to be living in all day. And we just need reminders. So the 3 reminders are actually small compared to what we should be praying 24 hours, but it's simply not possible. So the three prayers are reminders to set us right back into the zone of where we're supposed to be. It's a bit of a flip, a paradigm shift. It's not that the 3 prayers are repetitive. The three prayers are actually a shortcut of what it should be all day. We should be praying all day. And instead, the 3 prayers are these intervals. Yes, is that the word? Intervals? There are these exercise intervals that in between we should have the energy of prayer, and we need a reminder. So boom, those reminders set us right back into motion. Easier said than done, I know. But that's the idea. So that's intro number 3. And I think, again, the most important intro of the way we're going to try seeing what prayer is a place of being. In the book, we go through level 1 as the lowest level of prayer. Level 2 is the middle level of prayer. And level 3, the highest level of prayer. For a minute, to talk about level 3, which is the ultimate, and then we'll shift back, is what does it look like? What does it look like a person who is in the consciousness of prayer all day? How does that person look different than a person who is not in consciousness of prayer all day? Very well said. Very well said. The level of living is extremely, it seems intense, but it's extremely deep. It's very sensitive. And it's, what's the word? It's very plugged in. We're plugged into ourselves and we're plugged into the universe. We say it every day in the morning prayers, Kol haneshama tahalolka, every soul will praise God. And the Talmud writes that it doesn't mean that every soul will praise God. It means that on every breath, al kol neshima, on every breath, we will praise God. Imagine we lived with an elevated conscious that literally every breath that we inhale and exhale, we're massaging God's ego. What that means is not that we're massaging God's ego, not that we're praising God. What that means is that we're living in an elevated space. This is not massaging God's ego. This is us living in an elevated space. As far as God is concerned, does it really matter? Maybe. Does it matter if you say this praise or this many times or that many times? I don't know. But what it is, and this ties right into the translation of the word tefillah, is an elevated consciousness. Is that we're living inspired, we're living elevated, we're living in a zone where we feel so much more of the universe around us, and that's called praying all day. Praying all day doesn't mean necessarily that a person is wrapped in a tallis all day. Praying all day means that they're living in that elevated space all day. And that's possible. That's attainable. It's hard. It's very hard. And when the real world starts throwing arrows at us, and stress comes, and then challenges come, and questions come, and arguments come, we can easily lose focus, and that's why it's time for mincha. We could snap right back in. And then the world starts again. It roars. And then evening comes, and we have the opportunity to snap back in again. And this is the general idea of what prayer is supposed to get. So I assume that after this introduction, I hope you say, I would love to pray all day. Imagine living like this. Tell me how, right? So for that, I invite you to the next 6 lessons. I'm kidding. Hopefully we get something covered tonight, but there is some truth to that it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of intellectual and emotional work to build that out. But hopefully today we get a little bit of it. I hope. Somebody was going to ask something? You thought about asking something. You say, yeah, I was feeling you. You have a good question. Norm is asking if he was ripped off because I said that mincha and then the world starts again and you have Ma'ariv. There are some that just as they pray the earliest that they can in the morning, which is at daybreak, Netz it's called, So there are some that daven mincha, they pray mincha also early, at like 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because it's a ready time. It's the first opportunity that they can pray again. They jump on the opportunity to do a mitzvah. There's a lot. There's quite a few mincha minions in offices around. Right behind my house, there's two. Right between Wilshire, on Wilshire between Crescent Heights and La Cienega, there are two mincha minions, which is amazing. From just people in the buildings and from around, and they do it early. It's like a 1:30 mincha, and that would be what I'm describing. Many people do it together, and God bless them. That's okay. Very good question that are really intertwined. The first question is that you're asking, Kevin, is if the words have any value, the words of the book. If it's an experience, then maybe get in there with your head. Why do you need the words? It's a great question. Hopefully, we'll address it. About the space is also a great question. Is there any particular setting or location that encourages this experience stronger than another space? Both great questions, and I hope that we address them both. Yes, I hope that we'll address that as well. What you're saying is that davening, praying, is also a mitzvah, and it's not just a mitzvah. It's called a mitzvah klalis. It's a general mitzvah that kind of includes some of these pathways that we talked about in the mitzvah class. And what davening is meant to accomplish is a discovery of some of those pathways. And if we could discover some of those pathways, first of all, that enhances all of our mitzvah experiences, and it brings to life also prayer itself. And some of the words, as mentioned, will be perhaps some of those access points, because it's come up already twice. Linda, right? Marion. What you're saying is that clearly location makes a difference. As we know that walking into some of these historic synagogues that have history or that have architecture could really transform our experience in those moments. And we are physical people, and our body reacts physically from architectural impressive elements, and our soul will react from spiritual architectural elements, which will be history or how many people have prayed there before, or things like this. And there's no question about it that our soul responds to that. And this is, I think, puts into perspective a little bit about location being important as well. Not to minimize the wonderful synagogues that we have here in Los Angeles that are obviously secondary to, the Kotel or Tzfat or whatnot. But as you mentioned, if we collectively include the prayers of the multitudes, of the tens of thousands of prayers that have been there, that itself elevates a space. Let's move along here. What's the translation of the word tefillah? Does anybody know? This is my favorite question, because even our Israelis don't know the answer. How? Yes, it is, but how? For what? Which means what? Okay. Huh? Palal means what? So modern Hebrew speakers will say that Pei Lamed Plili, it sounds like something criminal or something like that they find in the word. It means to do, but there's no ayin. It's Pei Lamed, but it's missing the ayin. It could be to do. It could be to do. There's another shoresh, there's another core word that could come out of here, which is tofel. Tofel is to work through something. In Yiddish you say to oizgarbet, to work through something. No, that's a fey. That's a vase. This is a fey. To work through is like when you take something that's hard and you make it soft. You got to work through it, or to carve wood, to work through something. Tofel. So the translations of the word tefillah are a little bit ambiguous. What we want to accomplish with this question is to appreciate that tefillah is actually effort. It's not something that comes easy. It's not something that will be, you wake up in the morning, you say the words, and you did it. And that's hidden in the word tefillah. On page 129, which is the opening of chapter 11, from time to time, a person emerges from the world he inhabits, the world of our life, and addresses God. This is, in essence, the moment of prayer. And from that intimate, essential point, prayer grows and broadens in the form of consciousness, of love, and of words. What he's saying in this paragraph is that prayer is supposed to be this crisscross where we're moving now away from ourselves and entering a completely different space. Our sages say that prayer is called avoda, worship, or work. The same word was used to describe our temple sacrifices. But while the sacrifices entailed physical activity, prayer is the worship of the heart. As in the verse, serve him with all your heart. The temple service had two aspects: the national obligation to offer sacrifices, such as the morning and evening burnt offerings, and the obligation of individuals to bring personal sacrifices upon making a vow, for example, and other sacrifices. Prayer shares these two aspects. One, it's an ongoing obligation of the Jewish people as a whole, and the obligation of each individual as well. Right away, what we see here is that prayer has two notions. It has two elements, which is one of the first things that came up here about what is it? Is it a communal thing or is it a personal thing? Right away, we see from the earliest versions of prayer, which is the offerings in the Holy Beit HaMikdash, was that it had both. There's two elements here, and they're not mutually exclusive. I love this artist. His name is Zalman Kleiman. He's not with us anymore. These are, there's a lot going on in both of these pictures. Here you see a communal, individual dance happening. And here you see an individual a prayer happening. And I think that in these two portraits that he describes these two things, where you have people commune in a communal individual sense, and then he has the individual sense. I found this to be interesting. He was a Hasidic artist, and his pieces, these sold for in the millions. Yeah, they look nicer when when they're not digitized. Let's read a little more. On the other hand, on page 131, in a synagogue focused on the individual, the work of prayer is one's personal challenge. The congregation may pray in concert, but equally, one person may choose to stride from one end of the room to the other, another may be singing, another wandering about, and yet a fourth sitting in a corner and meditating. This is not prayer as communal experience, nor prayer corresponding to the communal sacrifices, but the prayer of the qualities that characterize the prayer of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as individuals. And here in this paragraph, he meshes the two together, because that's what he's trying to bring out here, that they could happen in one setting. Sometimes it's easier, as he did himself sometimes, after praying with the community and doing the rituals that the community is meant to do as the Siddur suggests, to then go on his own. But there's also a way to do that incorporated within the prayer of the community. This is a few paragraphs away, but it's an important piece. The architecture of these synagogues that he's describing, such as the humble Hasidic shtibel, creates a personal prayer space, shaped primarily in order for the individual to turn to God without interruption or distraction. He doesn't write it here, but some of the old Hasidic shuls, the shtiblach, as they call them, they all had secondary rooms. There was a primary room and a second room. And what was the purpose of the second room? The purpose of the second room was for people that wanted to engage a little bit removed from all those that are engaging in the communal setting, had the space to be there, but be on their own as well. This is not something we read about, I don't think, in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, where it describes prayer. Where it describes prayer over there, it describes the mechanics of prayer. It has the setting, it has the structure. This is what you read out loud. This is what you say standing. This is what you respond to each other. This you do on Mondays. This you do on Thursdays. And most of the Code of Jewish Law does not discuss the soul of mitzvahs. It discusses the mechanics of it. And so to this, it discusses the mechanics of it, not the soul of it. But here, while we're emerging to the soul of it, what we discover is that there's an entire universe behind prayer. And some of it wanders a little bit from maybe the rigid text of, not the Siddur, but the rigid text of the book, right? That says that you should, like we said before, to daven with the minyan or without the minyan. You got to be with the minyan. But a person could then, on his own, take the liberty to go on a journey on his own. This is still all part of the introduction. Let's go into the three methods. Any questions? Method number one. I was talking with JB in the beginning here, and what I liked, and you noticed it as well in this chapter, is the humanization of the struggle of prayer that he outlines here. And I think that we'll all identify with level one. As we grow to level 2 and level 3, it's going to become harder to imagine. But again, my hope is that we get a little glimpse of even the highest levels. So the first method he calls wrestling with the prayer book. He had a way with words. The first, simplest, and perhaps most natural technique has been suggested by a certain sage. Why he doesn't say his name, I don't know. I looked high and low for the sage. I still haven't found him. One should pray, he said, in the same way that one quarrels. One says a word, the other says a word, until things get heated. This approach does not require preparation before prayer. One simply takes the prayer book and struggles with it on all the points that we have discussed, understanding the words, concentration, and consciousness in relation to and about truth. One toils over every line of the text, every word, every part of a word, attempting to squeeze some meaningful kernel out of it. In addition, one struggles over the question, am I merely repeating the words of others, or is this something of particular relevance to me? This is, I think, the greatest form of prayer that exists right above the mechanical form of prayer. So for many that have been just rolling and doing and saying, but never taking a second look, this is extremely refreshing. To stop and to take a second look. It doesn't require any preparation. We're sitting there anyway. And if you're in a place that has a chazan and a choir and whatnot, you got time. You're not in a rush. You're going to be here a couple of minutes. Just to open it and to kind of delve into what these texts are as a study will arouse a lot of these feelings of prayer. It's simple. It's there. It's in the book. The rabbis put it together 2,000 years ago with this intention. And today, with the English translations and translations of any language, a lot of the Hebrew is a poetic Hebrew, even for Hebrew speakers. There's today translations to make it a modern Hebrew. Just what he calls wrestling with the prayer book alone will transform the way we pray. And it will introduce us to a deeper part of ourselves, a deeper part of the universe, and a deeper part of God. And for example, when we read how incredible God is, which could be understood as massaging God's fractured ego, it could also be understood on a second look how incredible God's world is. Not how incredible God is that his world is great. How incredible he shared it with me, and that automatically leads me to a space of gratitude, to a space of wholesomeness, to a space of thankfulness. It completely changes my experience. I'm in a different setting now. I'm in a different zone of consciousness. And if we would do this in the morning, just in this most basic way of the first method, our business interactions at 11 o'clock would be different than if we didn't do that morning. Now, by 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, it might get, it might start getting, it might wane off. It might get a little dusty. And that's why a quick shift right back into the prayer book will remind us to realign ourselves, and we go right back into that elevated space of consciousness. There's a word in Yiddish, and Yiddish is a language that unfortunately it's becoming a forgotten language. But there's a word in Yiddish, atefach hecher. Atefach hecher means a handbreadth higher, and this is a Hasidic term that encourages us to live one handbreadth above the ground. Not to fly in the sky. The fly in the sky is reserved for, for special people. But for most of us, one handbreadth higher means that we're not so earthy. We're not so attached to the ground. We're a little bit elevated. We're a little bit removed from that heaviness, from that weight that keeps pushing us down. A tefach hecher, one handbreadth higher. And wrestling with the prayer book in this format, in this formula, will give us that. I think. It's worked for me, and I think that you can try it and let me know if it doesn't work. If it does work, You don't have to let me know. I mean, I would appreciate if you let me know too. But if the opposite, I'm saying if it, let me know. If it doesn't work, I don't want to hear about it. If it does work, let me know. This is a method that the rabbis have introduced to the diaspora Jews, as mentioned, over 2,000 years ago, to keep us in check. There is a commandment to visit Jerusalem 3 times a year. There's a commandment that exists while the Beit HaMikdash is standing in its full glory, that we should go visit the temple 3 times a year. Those that can't, at least once a year. That's according to Maimonides, the minimum threshold to fulfill that mitzvah once a year. It's an annual mitzvah that at least once a year we should visit the temple. And if you can, to do that mitzvah with more vigor, 3 times a year. And what was the purpose? The purpose was to get this recharge that we're talking about, to get this elevated sense of consciousness. They had deep minds, they had deep souls, and once a year was able to put them into the right zone. The rabbis sending us off from Jerusalem 2,000 years ago knew that we are going to be headed into turbulent waters, and 3 times a day might not be enough to keep us in this elevated space. But this is the architecture behind prayer on the most basic level. And again, the mechanical version of prayer, it's great. I'm not going to say not to do it, heaven forbid, but it's missing the point of what was established here. What was established here was to give us a refreshed daily sense of consciousness that should attach us to the source. We'll have a great day. We'll have a great evening, and another day starts tomorrow. It's a great question. What you're asking is that there is a perspective that exists about grab what you can and internalize that rather than try to say the whole thing. This is a cornerstone, actually, in Hasidic philosophy, that we believe that we should pray the whole prayer and all the words the way they are in the book. But obviously it's very hard to wrestle with the book in its entirety every day. So maybe most of it we'll read the way we read. But if every day we could grab one sentence that will lift us up, that's all we need. And that's similar to what you're saying, that it could just be one sentence that will grab us. It doesn't mean that we're wrestling with the entire book every day. That's very difficult. But to wrestle with one line, and every day we could move the line, or every week we say, this week I'm going to wrestle with this line. Next week I'm going to wrestle with the next line. And some Hasidic masters, some prayerees, some master daveners, master praise have been. That has been their method. That they would take pieces at different times and dance with them. Method number 1, this method of serving God was taught by the Baal Shem Tov, and he illustrated it with a homiletic reading of God's command to Noach: make a shining stone for the ark. The word ark in Hebrew is teva, can also mean word. A person must work on a word of prayer. This addresses what we just mentioned, a word of prayer, even when it's like a lifeless stone, until it begins to gleam and becomes like a glass through which divinity shines. And how does one do so? The verse continues, come, you and your entire household, into the teva, which means that a person comes and puts all of his being, his thoughts, his feelings, his memories, and dreams into a word, a single word of prayer. It's denotation and connotation. Thus does he proceed word after word and sentence after sentence. This approach of the service of prayer does not require any particular preparation, as we said before. One simply takes a prayer book and struggles with one's awareness, with one's concentration, working hard, so that as one prays, something will occur. The barrier between oneself and the prayer book will dissolve until one day, as one pronounces one word, the prayer book will cease to be a text from which one is reciting and turn into a book in which one's own self is written. This is why he was good. These are amazing words. These are amazing words. And I can testify that he lived that way. He's not writing poetry here. These are words that are coming literally out of his experience. When he would walk around with his prayer book, most time it was closed, I think, if I recall. Sometimes he would open it. It was a conversation. It was a conversation. He was talking with his soul. He was talking to his God. He was talking to his world. It was an unbelievable thing to watch. I wish, it was Shabbos. We couldn't record these things, but watching it is enough to make somebody just crave that and want to do it themselves. And here he's telling us how, at least somewhat. This is all option number one. The next approach is a little bit more advanced. Page 146. The next approach also requires that a person intellectually plumb the depths of his prayer's meaning. But in this case, one's efforts are planned based on a preparatory learning session. That's the next 6 weeks. This session of learning does not necessarily involve the prayer book text. It must, however, be concerned with awareness of the divine. The purpose of this learning is not merely intellectual acquisition, but study that is directed intentionally towards the work of prayer to penetrate all aspects of one's psyche. The purpose of this study is to incorporate it into prayer. The more in-depth a person's study and the more details he contemplates, the more we can transform that topic into a real and tangible image as though it's standing before our eyes. This is a little bit abstract. Let's go on with one more paragraph and he'll bring it down a little bit. For instance, a person can meditate on the meaning of gratitude. He begins from the simplest notion, acknowledging the good that another has done, and then considers in-depth questions such as, what is appreciation composed of? What's the nature of its being? How does it connect us to God? Having delved into these questions from every angle, he brings the topic to his prayers. He searches for these themes of appreciation and gratefulness in the words that he is reciting, in his praise, requests, supplications, and thanks. All of these now reflect appreciation until he reaches the Modim de Rabbanan, which is towards the end of the repetition. We thank you for that we thank you. The foundation stone and precis of all prayer is to thank God for the gift of being able to pray. What he's saying in method number 2 is a lot more complex. What it is something like this. A person will study deeply. The example that he uses is the example of gratitude. So let's use this as an example. A person studies gratitude deeply. That means that we study it from all angles. We could study it mystically. We can study it psychologically. We can study it emotionally. We can study the subject of gratitude from many, many different angles. And now, from the perception of gratitude, we open up the prayer book. So we're coming to the book with a preconceived notion that now we are praying through the lens of gratitude. What happens now is that the entire prayer will align through that lens. Almost as if, they say that when you buy a new car, you suddenly see that car on the road everywhere. You ever notice this? Why? Was it not there before? It was there all along. It's the same amount. Suddenly people think that the car that they bought is the most popular car on the road, and it isn't. Nothing changed. But because they got that car, now they see it more. They see everything out of that lens. When a person is when a person is deeply embedded in an idea, they have an idea in their head, a business plan or some other thing, everything they see is going to be seen from the perspective of whatever is cooking in their head. This form of prayer is to choose a topic, to choose an area in which we want to perfect ourselves, in which we want to become deeper, in which we want to become better at, and use prayer as a system in which that will be perfected. So gratitude would be something that we would study, let's say, spend a week, 2 weeks, take a PhD in gratitude. And now you start praying from the perspective of gratitude. Every word in the book starts being seen from that lens. Even when we're asking for Rofei Cholim, for somebody to be healed, it's part of the gratitude conversation. And we're asking things as part of the gratitude conversation. We're thanking, it's obviously part of the gratitude conversation. Everything starts being seen from a singular lens. That's a different form of prayer. That's using prayer as a mechanism to elevate our experience in a particular area. It's almost as if using prayer as a tool for growth, which is one of the things that it was created to do. Precisely. You would choose a particular midah, as you're saying, it is connected to the midot. You would choose a particular emotion, and from that emotion, you're able to see everything and work on it through prayer. And then the prayer elevates that experience. We'll run through this quickly, 148. There is no need to change any word nor its meaning. One must only understand its implications as if for the first time. The type of study takes hold of him and electrifies him as he draws into itself all the words of prayer and gives them new meaning. This experience is not a rare phenomenon. It's hard, it takes study, but it's not rare. To the contrary, we constantly experience its equivalent in other areas of our lives. When a person desires something passionately, when one has a memory of an experience or a strong emotion, we will find it everywhere and in everything. While working or at being at home, walking in the street or meeting people, anything will cause us to awaken that emotion, directly or indirectly, as a similarity or as a contrast. For instance, if a person's close relative is ill, then we would relate every blessing, every request, every psalm in the prayer service to that. He is not able to understand the words of prayer in any other way. Here we go for number 3. And I hope we don't get electrocuted on number 3. But you see where we're climbing here. The first one is open and available to anybody sitting on any chair with any book that they have in their hands. Any prayer book, that is. The second one requires a movement, a more, what's the word? A more outside in, you mentioned before, a more taking initiative, our own initiative to make something happen. Finally, the third approach, we find the third approach to meaningful prayer on page 149 described in the Mishnah. The early Hasidim, and the Mishnah then is talking about not the Hasidim of the Baal Shem Tov, which came about 1,000 years after the Mishnah. It's talking about pious Jews that the Mishnah addresses as Hasidim, would set aside an hour and then pray so that they would turn their hearts to God. This path is of an extremely individual nature. Here, a person comes to terms with the truth of themselves. They attempt to reach within themselves the ideal of perfection, since it's very difficult indeed, almost impossible, to explain and describe such a thing to another. This path is shrouded in mystery. It's a path upon which few proceed. So what do we gain from this, right? So should we embark on this path, or we shouldn't embark on this path? He's almost discouraging us from taking this path. What's unique about the third path is that it's a aha moment that people have in their lives, rarely, but it's an experience that we can go back to, and it's reborn the minute we remember it. It's not exactly it, but it's similar. You know, some people describe a transformative moment in different times of their life. When their first child is born, maybe the first time they're at the kotel. Sometimes, God protect us, if a close family member departs. There are places where there is a transformative moment in time that's many times just a minute that encapsulates a deep, deep emotion. And every time a person will go back there, it will light them back up. And a person doesn't need many of those experiences in their life, and probably less the better. Few of those experiences is enough to give us that oomph when we need it. What he's describing over here is that there's a person that could accomplish through prayer, sometimes other ways, is this deep sense of wholesomeness, I think is the right word, a wholesomeness where they know who they are, they know why they're here, they know their surroundings, it's not full control, it's full appreciation of their truth. It's very deep, it's very unique, but that is the highest level of prayer, because when a person prays from that point of existence, there's nothing in the world that exists other than that pivotal, true moment. It's almost like Atzmos, similar to what we had in the godlike lesson where we talked about Atzmos, this fifth level, this essential level of everything. It's like he says, it's hard to bring out. One of the things that he talks about in the chapter, which is important, I didn't address it at all tonight, is how do you know if the experience that you're having is real or not? You could go into a meditation and also feel very good. How do you know if the experience is real or not? And he explains, and read it inside the book, it'll explain it better than I will here, is to see if it has any positive effects. If it has positive effects, long-lasting effects spiritually, you know that you're on solid ground. I don't want to suggest that I'm familiar with level 3, because I don't know. I don't know. I do think, though, that if a person could think in their minds of this type of experience that I'm describing, where they had a moment of wholesomeness, I think that they've experienced something like this. It's rare. It doesn't come around often, but I believe that that's what he's talking about. Now, the question is, and that's the hard part of level 3, is to bring that to life on a daily basis. To revive that in our prayer on a daily basis is very difficult. That's something that's very hard. That's something that requires real focus of the mind to do it correctly and to do it honestly. Because with these types of things, it's all in the mind, and nobody's standing with a gauge what we accomplish. This is really between us and ourselves, and it's a matter of being honest with ourselves. And level 3 remains a very difficult level to attain, but I do believe that a lot of us are familiar with it. And if we would bring it, internalize it a little bit more, bring it to home a little bit more, it will give us that tefach hecher, that elevated space. Yes, right. And I think that that's what we're describing. He concludes chapter 11 with great words. And this really is the conclusion of the book originally. 2 chapters were added later to later editions. This was originally the end of the book. And so it is, and so is it in the way of prayer. One person prays and another person prays that he will be able to pray. One person serves and another serves so that one day he will truly become a servant of God in the service of the heart, which is prayer. This guy dances with words. It's incredible. I want to conclude with 2 stories on the topic of prayer. 2 opposite stories. The first, I heard the story from my brother-in-law who spent a couple of Lag BaOmers in the mountains, the LA mountains, for a few years. They didn't do it this year. It was Saturday night. It was hard, but in other years they went there. And some of us may remember a couple years ago, there was a tragic incident in Meron where there was a crush, and sadly some 45 souls lost their life over there. God protect us. They were there up in the mountain without any power, without any connection to the outside world, and had no idea that anything happened. So while most Jews around the world were concerned, nervous, hopeful, and unfortunately it minimized the Lag BaOmer celebrations in many circles, in many gatherings, where they were, life was roses. They simply had no idea that anything happened. They were on a hilltop without any power, any connection, and it was fantastic. The stars were shining bright. The world was perfect as far as they knew. And then the morning after, they're driving down the hill and suddenly their phones blow up and they see, and the guilt may be that they had such a fun night while the world is mourning. That's one episode where the experience and the world are at odds, where a person is on a mountaintop, enjoying, connecting, celebrating, but the world below is burning. And they're oblivious to it, which is incredible, but there's a large disconnect between the person and their world. And I don't believe that that's prayer. I don't believe that disconnect between the world and us is supposed to be. God created a world that we live in. It's not meant to be disconnected on that level. It feels very good when it is. And sometimes it's good to zone out and shut off our phone for a couple hours. Nothing will happen. But to live that way is not ideal. The second episode takes us to my uncle here in Las Vegas, who has a child that is autistic and is a flight risk. So sometimes he's an expert getting out of the house. I mean, that place is locked up with everything you can imagine. But he figures it out. He figures out how to get out, and when they get out, they just run. So it was Shavuot a couple years ago that they had installed a new window, and along with the new window, they installed a new bar. And the young boy figured, he has a sharp eye, brilliant mind, he figured how he's going to get out there. And it's around midnight when my uncle was sitting and doing the Shavuot all-nighter and did not even notice that his son crept out of the window and ran away. He notices about 15, 20 minutes later, because there's a draft in the house, and he goes and he sees the windows open, he sees the bars are open, he goes to his bed and the bed is empty. Can imagine the panic. The panic, he calls volunteers from here, Hatzalah, who go and help, and he calls some others. There's a rabbi nearby. We should never know. We should never know, and God protect us. But thank God there's a happy ending. And the happy ending is that about an hour and a half later, the boy is discovered, reunited with his family, and there's obviously tears that cannot be held up by anybody there in the room, but an incredible dance breaks out. Whoever was there was some boys that were there learning with him, a couple of yeshiva students, or the other rabbi. A dance of joy breaks out that there's nothing in the world that can describe the joy that existed in that room. And that's the opposite end of where prayer, the world, and joy meet, where the world is not separate from our experience, but our world and our experience, our pain and our celebration together become meshed as one. And if I can suggest, one of the identifying factors of what is a successful prayer is when that happens. When our joy, our pain, our celebration, our challenges and our sadness and our God who loves us all come together, that's a successful prayer. If we ejected from the cockpit and we're just floating in the skies, it feels amazing, but that's not the prayer described in this book. This concludes lesson 6. Thank you for flying with us. It's been incredible. We had a really fun series. Let me just run through a little bit what we had. We had the spiritual worlds in lesson 1, the map of our soul in lesson 2. We had spirituality embedded within physics, lesson 3. We had that we were godlike, and we remain godlike from lesson 4. The secret back end of the mitzvot in lesson 5, and of course, feeling divinity through prayer that we had today. A huge thank you to AJ, who made this all happen, along with Rabbi Schatz for pulling it together. Thank you very, very much, everybody. And of course, a big thank you to Norm for putting me in Germany, Spain, and I don't know where else, London and Japan.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.